Welcome back, everyone, here on Zoom and on Facebook who are following this conference. And I have the pleasure and honor to chair this fascinating panel, the role of the superstructure, ethnicizing by language, religion, culture, with 4 papers on 4 different cases. I will introduce the speakers as they start. So the first speaker of the panel is Andrei Sorescu from the Research Institute of the University of Bucharest. Andrei Sorescu is a postdoctoral researcher right now at the Research Institute of the University of Bucharest, prior to it at the New Europe College Institute for Advanced Studies in Bucharest. And he's a graduate of the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. His research interests include transnational conceptual history, the history of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and colonial imperial history. And his paper is titled Catching Up with Transylvania, How Romania Imagined Kinfolk as its Betters, 1890-1918. So, Andrei, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Let's get cracking with it, shall we? I'll share my screen. As far as I can tell, this thing does work. Alrighty, that's good. So this is very much part of my current project at the ICUB in Bucharest, which is a slightly broader project, also something that has come out of my PhD. It's practically a chapter that I've massively expanded upon. And I'm quite interested in the way in which self-comparison is a force that shapes both national self-perception, but also the internal dynamics of nationalism. And for this particular presentation, I've chosen to focus on how the so-called Old Kingdom of Romania prior to 1918 imagined Transylvania and looked up to it in a fairly ritualized manner. First of all, self-comparison is not that much of a hot topic in either comparative history. I mean, the reflexive categories through which historical actors compare themselves to others, and even less so, I would argue, as a dynamic of nation-state building. With apologies to Benedict Anderson and his specter of comparison, one also has to bear in mind the spectrum of comparison, the broad array of socio-cultural units with which one historical actor might compare themselves, which are obviously always constructed in that nothing that might seem ex post natural to us is necessarily natural to them in the past. Emulation and comparability may or may not be part of the debate, in that comparability is understood not always as a matter of emulation, but also as a matter of failed, impossible, desirable but not yet achieved emulation. My work here, my discussion here also speaks to the broader issue of the national distribution of labor beyond the borders of a rump state as the Old Kingdom of Romania perceive themselves. So right now I'm just laying a general groundwork, and as far as the empirics are concerned, I'd much rather that the audience here and the panelists pay some heed to what I think are the more general problems, so that we keep the discussion more theoretically informed in the end. What I would argue in the case of 19th century Romania is that this notion of a national distribution of labor beyond the borders of the legitimate independent nation state still eyeing its kinfolk is not reducible, or not always reducible, to irredentism or expansionism, but rather, in this case at least, was reframed as a rhetoric of self-criticism. Why is it that Free Romania, as they called it, România Liberă, still was in some ways lacking when compared to Transylvania? What then of the moral claim of the state as a steward of the nation in the broadest sense? What happens when, even though you're not actively making political claims to territories beyond the nation state, you're still imbued with the notion that on a cultural level and in some unspecified future, you still are the potential Piedmont. It's also a matter of how the causes and origins of this perceived lag are implotted in public discourse. whose agency in the end is to be lauded both at home and abroad for the state of affairs? Where does it come from, and who is to blame? And finally, what can folk achieve even in spite of national oppression may be reinterpreted on a social level at home. The national question abroad might then, through some permutations, be understood as a foil, or again, by analogy, as a model for solving, or at least discussing, the social question at home. Right. So this is just a very brief chronology of things. There's no need to go back to time immemorial. Suffice it to say that as of 1848, when things start taking off in both the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia and in Transylvania in terms of more intense cultural convergence, you have parallel revolutions which end up being rather entangled. In 1859, Moldavia and Wallachia unite to become Romania. In 66, when King Charles I of the Hohenzollern House comes to the throne of Romania, this is a massive watershed that is closely mirrored on a chronological level by dualism in Austria-Hungary, which has massive impacts for the way in which Transylvanian Romanians see their place, or rather despair with their potential place within the Kingdom of Hungary. In 1878, the Kingdom of Romania reaches independence, and as of 1881, it proclaims itself to be a kingdom. And I should note here that in 1878, though the actual empirics of it may be slightly overblown by nationalist historiography, yes, you have Transylvanian volunteers who feel that they must rally to the Romanian cause more generally. What concerns us here is that as of the 1890s, partisan politics in the kingdom start bleeding into national, previously merely cultural involvement, and yet, given a secret treaty concluded between Romania and the Central Powers, there is a self-limiting aspect to this engagement on the part of Romanian politicians, though not so much on the part of the Romanian public. Now, another thing that is important for our discussion here is that there is a fond circular disenchantment with what had been achieved by that point. So in the early 1900s, already the fact that more than 40 years had passed since Romania had become at least a partly united state from the standpoint of the nationalists, had not reaped the dividends, had not yielded the rewards that were supposed to have been achieved through land reform, through the census vote, and more generally a sense that development had been captured by a bipartisan machine, pretty much riven apart by the conservatives and the liberals, all fed into factional and anti-establishment strife from a point onwards. And finally, this is not something that I think we'll have time to get into right now. Romania enters World War I only 1916, and whether or not the Romanian war effort was to have been directed towards emancipating Transylvanians or other kinfolk in other places was a matter of contention, and heavily so, in fact, heavily debated at the time. Right. I should mention here as well that Transylvania was not the only point of reference on the agenda of self-comparison. The immediate obvious choices for comparison for the Old Kingdom were Bukovina and Bessarabia, Bukovina being part of Austria, Bessarabia part of Russia, the Armenians, or rather the Macedonian Romanians as they were called back then in the Balkans, Bulgaria, seen as a potential rival and or model at the time. But also, I think this is quite interesting, on a global scale, Romanians took a keen interest in the Boers during the Boer Wars, seen as anti-imperial peasants who could teach lessons to the peasants at home. Ireland, which was seen as a negative example of a agrarian country gone wrong under imperial oppression, and also, for instance, Scandinavia, with Norway and Denmark in particular seen as robust peasant democracies with almost full literacy and with political stakes, where peasants held political stakes in the running of the state. So In the case of Transylvania, at least, but even more broadly, there were focal points of self-comparison that had to do with the perceived economic independence of kinfolk, national unity across class boundaries, which was part of the self-criticism of Romanians in the kingdom who saw themselves as being very divided by class, the cultural advancement of Transylvanian Romanians, including higher levels of literacy, or at least perceived to be as such. And this was in turn driven by what was seen again as a model of rich, vibrant associational life, even across the divide between Uniates and Greek Orthodox Romanians. All of this, by the way, was part of a trans-partisan consensus, i.e., everyone from the liberals and the establishment to the agrarianists to the populists, the socialists, felt that yes, Transylvania was indeed in some way in the lead, even in spite of the imperial national oppression that was affected upon Romanians, presumably, but also, and especially in more dissenting quarters, this was seen as a quickly domesticized form of toothless self-criticism to the point of mere ritual. Finally, and I'll get back to this in a minute, Transylvania was also seen pragmatically as a bulwark, as an ethnic bulwark against Austro-Hungarian expansionism and influence. In a certain sense, it was good that Romanians in Transylvania were as well off as they seemed to be, if only because this also helped the Old Kingdom stave off the economic and perhaps even cultural influences of a strong imperial center. Now, this is just a bit of eye candy and just making sure a bit of people catch their breath for a minute there, and you can see why Romanians in the kingdom held the belief that this was part of a natural continuum of ethnic Romanianness on the map of Europe. But let's get into this idea. Where does this idea of relative backwardness in the Old Kingdom come from? So it has a prehistory. There's a marginal comment to the first European travelogue of a Wallachian nobleman, Dinicu Golescu, an account of my travels, first published in 1826, but really only rediscovered in 1910. This is a critical and famous text in which this Greek educated Wallachian nobleman travels to the west. He sees Austria. He even goes so far as to see, he goes as far as Switzerland and then some. And critics have always noted the fact that, yes, this is pretty much the urtext of Romanian national self-comparison when it comes to defining a relationship with the West and need to catch up. What has been less noted, and in fact has only been noted when this text was first republished in 1910, was that Golescu also made the same remarks with regard to Romanians in Transylvania and the Banat. And this was, again, something that fed into the discourse that I'm talking about here. Also in 19th century Romania, there's this broader rhetoric of indebtedness towards the role of Transylvanians in the 19th century national revival in the Old Kingdom. The fact that many educators, many major figures in literary and philosophical culture came from Transylvania, and yet this did not share the sense of historical cultural mission of the Old Kingdom, insofar as it prided itself to be the Latin bulwark of civilization in the Orient. Now, it's also important to note here that at no point that I've managed to identify, at least, were the Transylvanians seen as more Western in a way that is perhaps more familiar to us on a discursive level. It's not their Westernness as being part of an imperial context that links them with Western capital, with a Western infrastructure that is lauded or seen as worthy of emulation. Rather, their agency expressed in spite of imperial national oppression. In a certain sense, for Romanians in the kingdom, these Transylvanians exist almost in a void. It's them, their oppression, but not the systemic integration into Austria-Hungary that fosters their economic and cultural progress. So already in the 1880s, one finds the topos of a more advanced Transylvania in public discourse, but it's really in the 1890s that it becomes generalized. And it comes at a time when both the national question, which had been solved on some level in terms of the country's independence, but also the social question, the feeling that the land reform of 1864 had not delivered the economic promise that it should have to former serfs, made them entangle in public discourse as a matter of both ontology, if you will, but also of priority. How do we, as a nation state, address this external national question of the Transylvanians versus our internal social question? I guess the most relevant way of going about the most simple and straightforward way of going about this is to look at a number of micro case studies, if you will. And I'll start not so much with some liberal MP delivering an impassioned speech in parliament, but rather with something that is an official text destined for peasant consumption, published in 1905. It is something that was putatively published as a report, in fact, to the Royal House of Romania, which had financed the travels of one Leon Brejeru, the director of an agricultural orphanage, who had paid a visit to the major 1905 Jubilee exhibition in Sibiu, Nogseben, Hermannstadt, right, there you go, the three names, which I guess I should mention there, of the Astra Association, which had been very much seen as the model association of Transylvanian Romanians. This is the officialized, and I would call neutralized topos. Great were our wonder and our spiritual contentment upon hearing the villagers, their women and their children, all sing in response to the liturgy as one. So this guy had brought the orphans that had come with him to church on a Sunday. It seemed as if we were dreaming when that handful of Romanian peasants in their ancient costume, beautiful and pure, raised their voice to the Almighty in pious song. We looked at each other, wonder-struck by what we saw and heard, as if to ask one another, when will we, in our free country, reach this level of progress? Now, this may seem a tad subversive. Now, behold the piety, the ancient costume of these peasants. Behold, indeed, the instant pang of shame that is felt by this teacher and the children who accompany him. But this, I would argue, is very much a case in point by 1905, so by the early 20th century, of this discourse, whereby Transylvania is lauded as being a model, and that both the peasants but also his stewards, i.e. teachers, for instance, have to begin to emulate. And as I mentioned before, this was published, again, in theory at least, as an official report, although written in a fairly simple lingo, so as to be understood by the peasantry, for the eyes of the royal household itself. Let's sort of go with this and focus on the peasants for a little while. On the other hand, as I did mention, by the end of the 19th century, aside from the major parties of the liberals and the conservatives, one already finds contesting dissenting movements, and one of them is the peasantist party, Partiul Țăranesc in this case, in its earliest incarnations, headed by one schoolteacher, Constantin Dobrescu Argeș, who was also an MP for a while, and who delivers an interesting take on peasant blame and emulation, the social question at home, and the way in which it has to be solved versus the national question abroad. So in the political question, he says, our peasant has everything to demand. The question that must preoccupy us with every instant, regardless of party affiliation, is the peasant question. So note the transpartisan nature of this as an all-important question unto itself. And when I say question, I obviously harken back to Holly Case's excellent book on the age of questions, but we'll get back to that in a while, I hope. From a political, socio-economic, national point of view, the peasant question is therefore simultaneously amorphous, but also able to devour everything else. We are constantly concerned with the fate of our brothers beyond the mountains, of whom 85%, and this is obviously an exaggeration, but this is the way things are framed in parliament, it seems, are literate, and here not 10%. Romanians there have reached a full consciousness of their rights, but let us see, how have we fared? This is not to say Dobrescu-Argeș is against maintaining relationships with Transylvania, or indeed continuing offering continuing support to Transylvanian Romanians at a time when a lot of them had gotten into hot water for submitting memorandums to Franz Josef, claiming staking a claim for their rights. But this is rather an inward look at how the kingdom should start being more concerned with getting its own house in order, rather than spending time and resources on Transylvania, given that Romanians there, even in spite of oppression, seem to do so well. One also finds various other strands of agrarianism. This is really just an excerpt from another peasant newspaper, but this is interesting insofar as we see comparison brought home. In 1905, Romanians traveled from the kingdom to Sibiu to witness the one grand exhibition by the Transylvanians. On the other hand, 1906, on the 40th Jubilee of King Charles I's reign, many Transylvanians did come and visit for the celebration, and yet here we are now, looking at our guests, peasants from subjugated Romanian provinces, all sturdy and well-built with the look of alertness in their eyes. We could not help but think of our own poor villagers, all weak and wretched, old beyond their years, and thus saw all the better how far behind our villagers have come to lag their brothers. It looks as if peasants living under foreign rule were the free ones, and the subjected ones were our own. Subjugated in a free country, what mockery! I mean, this is obviously full of bombast and pathos, but this is just one example of a flurry of articles, some of them by fairly well-known politicians and public figures more generally, in the exact same tone. The idea that the comparison is brought home on this momentous occasion makes the celebration ring hollow, and again shows that there's nothing really to celebrate over the past 40 years if it has truly come to this. Just a few more vignettes, and I hope we're still good for time, rather, almost. The socialists are also a contending force, and in culture at least, a force to be reckoned with in the late 19th and early 20th century, and this is a quote from Constantin Dobrogeanu Ghera, the most important socialist theorist and one of the important socialist activists of his time, who reached notoriety as a literary critic. And this is an article he wrote in 1894 on artists as intellectual proletarians, in which he examined several case studies of major Romanian literati at the time who had risen from obscurity and yet were still in some way proletarianized. And when discussing the origins of a then famous and still famous Romanian poet from Transylvania had crossed the mountains, George Coșbuc, Ghera, for all his relative absence of national fervor, gives this relatively interesting explanation as to how and why Coșbuc was able to be a poet for both Transylvania and the Old Kingdom. And he goes to say, in Transylvania, the moral atmosphere of the culture classes, or at least part of them, is different from that here. There, at least in part, it is shaped by its national struggle with the culture classes of Hungarians. Nationalism in Transylvania is not a mere matter of parades and banquets. And this national struggle, Transylvania resembles free Romania as it was before 1848, where the cultural strata had a national struggle to wage. So in a certain sense, Transylvania is both in the future and that it has to be emulated. On the other hand, structurally, it is still in the past, which makes the fervor of Transylvanian Romanians more authentic. I mean, the critique of the inauthenticity of domesticated, officialized Romanian nationalism under the rule of a free state, as it were, is a part of this entanglement, in that for the Transylvanians, things were very much still painfully real. And finally, I think this is pretty much it. Yes, the populists, somewhat an offshoot of the socialists. By the early 1900s already, the left wing of the Liberal Party in and of itself, but this is a quotation from Constantin Stere, the figurehead of the movement, an ex-Narodnik who was born in Russia, much like Gera, in fact, and who delivered a very interesting vignette of what being a Piedmont might or might not mean. It was just as the peasant uprising of 1907, in fact, the last major European peasant jacquerie was breaking out, that Stere commented on the imperative of catching up as a matter of kairos and crisis. So however bad the momentary state of a people under normal conditions, should it possess sufficient vital force, it shall always have sufficient time to rectify that state. But are we under normal conditions, and is there still time enough ahead of us? And then Stere goes out to point to offer various details that he had gathered from his travels to Transylvania in the 2 years prior to the moment, extol the virtues of Transylvanian Romanians in both economy, culture, and so on and so forth, and then goes on to conclude, is it any wonder that the Romanian peasant has become a real political power in the struggle for national rights in Hungary? Again, there is both an entanglement between the social question and national question, the endo and the exo, if you will, but also a temporal entanglement. Is there enough time for us as there has been time for them? So, as a conclusion, how do nationalists compare? This is, I think, still a matter to be resolved on a more formal, general level. The problem of comparing like and like, after all, Romanians in the kingdom presume themselves to be axiomatically fundamentally the same as Romanians in Transylvania. We're not comparing apples with pears here from their standpoint. We're still comparing apples with apples, which, as far as the formal logic of comparison goes, is not exactly kosher. And it's also a matter of methodological nationalism going across borders in the age of comparative folklore and philology as disciplines just being born and becoming fortified. I had half a mind to talk of Transylvania as Bessarabia, Bukovina, as laboratories of historical divergence. It just felt a bit too pompous. But now I come back to it and say, perhaps this is the way in which, if we are to put ourselves in the shoes of Romanians in the Old Kingdom, we might make sense of the unclear temporal horizons that these relationships engendered, but also the very unclear temporal horizon of national unity. And in fact, and with this I must conclude, 1918 was, fortuitous as it was for Romanian nationalists and for the Romanian national project, it came sooner, I might say, than anyone could have anticipated, even in their most fevered dreams before 1914. And it was also post 1918 that the narrative that we have discussed so far disappeared almost instantly under the centralizing thrust of Bucharest policy. The fact that both Romanians in Transylvania, but also the new national minorities that were part of the extended kingdom, felt that Transylvania was given short shrift by being denied some form of autonomy, clearly shows this, at least. With this, I thank you. And really, if anyone has any comments regarding to any sort of case studies that might compare to this, I would be more than happy to include them. I'm currently finishing up an article that I'm submitting on precisely this topic. It's obviously a lot more detailed than this, so feel free to ask me supplementary questions on that as well. But frankly, so far, I've yet to encounter someone in 19th century France say, oh, woe is us. In fact, folks in Alsace or Lorraine are doing better, or something to that effect. So thanks again.
So thank you very much. It was really fascinating, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of comments. But I jump to the next presentation, which is Tim Corbett. Tim Corbett is a freelance historian and translator based in Vienna, who specializes in modern Jewish Austrian history. His work has been published in a variety of interdisciplinary journals, and he has translated 2 books and a range of articles on Jewish history and the Holocaust in Central Europe. His first book, a comprehensive 900-page history of Vienna's Jewish cemeteries, has been published last year. Corbett is an alumnus of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, having absolved a junior fellowship in 2014-15, during which he completed and defended his doctoral dissertation. And the title, Deutscher Stamm or Staatsvolk, Unlikely Intersections between Austrofascist and Jewish Discourses on Austrianness in the 1930s. So, Tim Corbett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gábor. Can you hear me okay? Great. I would just like to begin by expressing my warmest thanks to Bela Rashki for conceptualizing this really wonderful conference and for many insights he's shared with me on Austrian cultural history over the years, which have also had a formative influence on this paper. And just to say, it's a shame that he isn't here today. In the summer of 1934, Josef Roth, a Galician-born Jewish Austrian writer of great renown already in his own lifetime, published a polemic in a Paris-based newspaper for German exiles, which he wrote in response to an angry letter to the editor concerning his recent commentaries on National Socialism and German culture. The author of the letter, a German-speaking Jewish resident of Brno in Czechoslovakia, whom Roth dismissed as a, quote, Israelite vassal loyal to the Nibelungen, end quote, took exception to what he saw as Roth's deformations of German high culture in his journalistic essays, which this gentleman ascribed simply to the fact that Roth had apparently, quote, lost his homeland. To this, Roth retorted emphatically, quote, I have not lost my homeland. My homeland is Austria, not Germany. That very Austria, before the gates of which the Tatars were once brought to a halt, as are today the Germans, and for this reason, I am proud of it, end quote. When Roth was asked 3 years later in 1937 to make a contribution to a so-called emigrant publication in Paris, where he had been living since quitting Berlin in 1933, he opened his manuscript by characterizing this invitation as a, quote, undeserved honor, because in a political sense, I am no emigrant. I, who still have a political home, am proud to speak among the homeless, end quote. Going on to discuss the history of prominent literati in political exile, from Heinrich Heine to Victor Hugo, he concluded that his own times, the mid-1930s, demonstrated just how powerful is, quote, this paltry piece of paper that we call a Heimatschein, a certificate of baptism, a passport, or a document, end quote. These on the surface rather unassuming remarks, delivered in a laconic, if slightly hyperbolic tone typical of Josef Roth, on closer inspection reveal a sophisticated and sensitive engagement with the problematic connections between culture, statehood, citizenship, civil rights, and belonging that vexed all of Europe during the interwar period, and which would eventually determine who was allowed to live and who was destined to die in the many territories under Nazi control. Indeed, Roth's reflections resonate beyond the immediate political context of his time and are still relevant today if we consider how the nation state in Europe is defined, who is accorded citizenship, what rights and privileges this entails, or conversely, what deprivations the denial of a few paltry pieces of paper may incur. Roth's terse observations are also highly revealing of the very specific dynamics of citizenship and belonging, culture and nationhood, as they were unfolding in the immediate context of what he called his political homeland, Austria. During the period in question, from the spring of 1933 until the spring of 1938, Austria's short-lived experiment in republican governance had been brought to a violent end, and this little Alpine state, the involuntary successor to the Habsburg Empire, was undergoing its own experiment in authoritarian, some call it fascist or fascisant, rule. Roth's comparison between the successful deflection of the Mongols' attempted invasion of Vienna in the 13th century and the hitherto successful deflection of National Socialism at the time he was writing in 1934 is also deeply revealing. Austria as a so-called bulwark against enemy alien forces attempting to invade and subvert the essence of Austrian culture the Mongols, the Ottomans, and the French Revolutionary armies are prime examples, is an old trope indeed, one that in Roth's time was invoked repeatedly by the Austro-fascist chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss and his successor Kurt von Schuschnigg to legitimize their anti-democratic regime in the face of the twin threats of Bolshevism to the east and National Socialism to the west. What we have here then is a rather between Jewish and Austro-fascist discourses on the substance of Austrian culture and statehood in the volatile period between the two world wars. I call this intersection unlikely, but really I mean that it only seems unlikely if we follow the established narratives regarding both Jewish history and Austrian statehood during this time. On the one hand, Jewish-born European intellectuals of the interwar period, especially those like Josef Roth, who hailed from areas usually characterized as Eastern Europe, are often cast in the cliched mantle of failed would-be assimilants, those who desperately wanted to belong to their respective national communities, but inherently did not. This is most evident in the field of Jewish studies, where Roth continues to be called, in complete defiance to his own self-characterizations, such as the one I quoted above, a German Jew and a involuntary exile. Even among the more critical and sensitive of Roth's many biographers to date, who emphasized the almost paradox pluralism of his political and cultural allegiances through his relatively short lifetime, during which he was variably perceived and or decried as a, quote, socialist, a monarchist, a religious Jew, or a zealous Catholic, end quote, one looks in vain for discussions of the evident connections in discourse, if not also in political allegiance, between Jewish Austrians like Roth and the Austro-fascist movement. Paralleling this, the growing literature on the Austro-fascist regime tends to characterize this movement, which to be sure originated in Karl Lueger's anti-Semitic Christian Social Party and had close ties to the radical right-wing paramilitary Heimwehr, as inherently anti-Semitic. This is especially evident in a copious volume published in 2018 entitled Anti-Semitism in Austria from 1933 to 1938, which weighs in with a staggering 1,200 pages on this topic. It is, of course, difficult to argue with such a voluminous collection. However, the sources I will briefly address in this talk suggest to me that something has gone missing in these one-sided portrayals, as indeed the historiography of this period within Austria continues to be highly politicized between left and right, and artificially divided in scholarly discourse between ethnicized fields like Jewish and Austrian, or worse, German studies. To date, this has left no room in the debate for considering the various ways in which the Austro-fascist regime was at least ambivalent about, if not proactively concerned with, forging allegiances with the country's significant Jewish population, and conversely, the ways in which many Jews actively subscribe to certain key elements of Austro-fascist ideology. Such a consideration, I argue, opens up new perspectives on both the longevity and complexity of processes of cultural becoming and nation building in Austria through modernity. In the time remaining, I will sketch some of these unlikely seeming intersections with regard to the writings of three key individuals from Austria in the 1930s, namely Josef Roth, Stefan Zweig, and the Austro-fascist chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg. Unlikely though these textual bedfellows may appear, though Roth and Zweig were good friends and corresponded copiously until Roth's untimely death in 1939, this paper argues that they each mobilized strikingly similar tropes to conceptualize Austrian culture and nationhood, in particular emphasizing the peculiarity of the Austrian people, not merely as a, quote, German tribe, but by recourse to the Habsburg past as endowed with a unique cultural mission in the heart of Europe. What I aim to show with this sketch is that conceptions of Austrian culture and nationhood in the interwar period were far more fluid, dynamic, and polysemous than has often been credited in historiography to date. Moreover, it is striking that the most groundbreaking historiography on Austrian cultural history of recent years, I think here, for example, of the works of William Johnston and Moritz Czaki, draws conspicuously often on the discourses of such ostensibly marginalized Jewish intellectuals to trace the modern conceptions of Austrian culture, state, and nationhood, reaching back as far as the late 19th century. Roth's much discussed turn away from his socialist sympathies in the 1920s and towards Habsburg legitimism in the 1930s is evident not least of all in his fictional writings. It is no coincidence that his most Austrian works, like Radetzky Marsch and Die Kapuzinergruft, which Stefan Zweig would after Roth's death call, quote, the epitaph of the Austrian Empire, end quote, were all published between 1932 and 1938. Roth's correspondence with Zweig documents more than a mere nostalgia for bygone times, however, more than a mere engagement with an Austria that had, quote, long since passed from existence, as is commonly claimed by Roth's biographers. In the many letters the two friends exchanged during the 1930s, Roth gave voice to his profound engagement, not just with a romanticized past, but with the very real political circumstances of his day and age, evincing a vitriolic contempt for what he in August 1932 called, quote, diese Scheißdemokratie, this shit democracy, while also demonstrating time and again his open sympathies for the Austrofascist movement. In May 1933, just days after Chancellor Dollfuss performed a legal coup d'etat by abolishing parliament, Roth wrote to Zweig that, quote, the Jews are now in demand, and that, quote, the Christian socials of the Vaughan persuasion are currently on our side, here referring to Karl Vaughan, the chairman of the Christian Social Party at the time, and a significant champion of Robert Hecht, the lawyer and ministerial head of department who devised the legal arguments needed to dismantle Austrian democracy and enable the Austro-fascist regime. Hecht was born into a Jewish family, converted to Catholicism in 1934, and would become one of the first prominent Austrian victims of the Nazis in 1938. He is just one of many frequently overlooked examples of a prominent Jewish proponent of Austrofascism. To be sure, a convert to Christianity could only be classed as Jewish through an anti-Semitic or at least ethnicizing lens. Yet this is a case in point of how historiography on Austrofascism has tended to overstate the movement's anti-Semitic tendencies while downplaying the involvement of Jews and Jewish-born individuals in the Austrofascist regime. Roth represents a similar case, in fact, as a Jewish-born individual who loudly proclaimed to have converted to Catholicism in the mid-1930s, and who was reported to have regularly attended Mass during his final years in Paris, though no conversion certificate has ever been found. In the summer of 1935, he wrote to Zweig that he believed, quote, in a Catholic empire of German and Roman character, and that he was, quote, close to becoming an Orthodox, perhaps even a militant Catholic, end quote. Another pointed example of his adherence to Austro-fascist creed during this period, which cast Austria as the Catholic and thus superior alternative to Nazi Germany, and as the true heir to the Holy Roman Empire. Bizarrely, none of these statements, which have been in the public domain in Roth's collected works for over half a century now, have stopped Roth from being championed repeatedly as the quintessential failed assimilant and or Jewish exile in later historiography. Roth's prodigious journalistic publications during these years appeared conspicuously often in Austro-fascist forums, so for example in the Christliche Ständestadt, a right-wing Catholic newspaper funded by the Austro-fascist regime. In June 1935, for example, Roth published a response to critics of his fictional works, especially Radetzky Marsch, who perceived these as critical of Austria and thus as unpatriotic. A salient irony, given how often today, most recently in Peter Judson's magnum opus, these works are dismissed as peddling nothing more than, quote, literary nostalgia. In any case, Roth took this opportunity to clarify his views on post-Saint-Germain Austria, which he argued did not just constitute the, quote, little Alpine country in which we are forced to live. We are still that grand idea without not even our little country could have survived just 1 week. The Austrian idea, he continued, is no patriotic idea, these are his quotation marks, by the way, but almost a religious one. We are not the second German state, but the primary, that is to say, the very first German and supranational and Christian state, end quote. Roth dismissed his critics as defending rather the notion of the, quote, second Germany and the little Alpine country, end quote. In other words, the idea of Austria, in obvious reference to National Socialism, as a mere Gau, whereas the true Austria was, quote, universal, Catholic, supranational, pious, and agreeable to God, end quote. These rather admittedly dense reflections reveal fascinating parallels to Austrofascist ideology, which, to repeat, cast Austria in pointed distinction to Nazi Germany as the better Germany, a Catholic and essentially supranational empire nation, as Kurt Schuschnigg summarized Austria's historic mission in his 1937 treatise Dreimal Österreich. The Habsburg Empire, he claimed, was, quote, to form the bridge to a modern realization of the imperial idea, end quote, a mission in which the empire had failed, but which the new Austria continued, quote, in the spiritual and cultural realm, end quote. This Third Austria, as he called it, in obvious contrast to the Third Reich, traced its lineage over the Habsburgs and Charlemagne back to the Roman Empire, and was thus the true empire, the true Germany, and upholder of the true imperial mission in Europe. This mission, Schuschnigg summarized paradoxically as both of, quote, supra-ethnic significance, and at the same time, a, quote, magnificent German mission, thus revealing a certain schizophrenia in Austria's self-conception during this time. This is what Josef Roth, in his review of Schuschnigg's magnum opus, published in the Christliche Ständestaat a few weeks before the Anschluss, cited as the conflict between the people of Austria as either a German tribe or a supranational Staatsvolk, a body politic. Concerning Schuschnigg's Dreimal Österreich, which was obviously conceived, if rather unsuccessfully, as a response to Hitler's Mein Kampf, it is notable that although he lauded various outspoken anti-Semitic politicians like Karl Lueger and Leopold Kunschak, he at no point made any anti-Semitic statements, indeed did not mention the issue of Jewishness at all, even though a whole string of social democrats upon whom he poured his scorn, from Otto Bauer through to the later Holocaust victim Robert Danneberg, were Jewish or Jewish-born. Given the prevailing anti-Semitic atmosphere in Austria during this period, it would have been only too easy for Schuschnigg to capitalize politically by mobilizing anti-Semitic tropes. The fact that he didn't is interesting and highlights my earlier point that historians today have perhaps overemphasized the role of anti-Semitism in the Austrofascist movement, to the detriment of appreciating the complex intersections of the time. Schuschnigg's magnum opus was even published by Jakob Higner, another Jewish-born convert who played a prominent role in the Austrofascist public domain. What Schuschnigg did discuss at length, however, was, quote, Austria's mission in the Christian Occident, emphasizing especially the genius loci of Vienna and its special mission too. This he defined as acting as a, quote, bridge and mediator between the peoples and states that once belonged to the old Austria, or in other words, quote, Catholic responsibility and European solidarity. Schuschnigg lamented the fact that the great powers were not guided in 1918 by, quote, European thinking during the formulation of the Paris peace treaties, creating a mosaic of, quote, rather powerless nation states in Central Europe, rather than ensuring the endurance of a supranational Central Europe. Henceforth, it was Austria's mission, so his conclusion, to act as Europe in miniature, a small state embodying great supranational principles. This brings me to the final and most unlikely discursive intersection, namely the work of Stefan Zweig. While I think Josef Roth's words and his choice of allegiances during these years speak for themselves, it is rather more difficult to suggest that Zweig was in any way consciously linked to the Austrofascist movement. On the contrary, Zweig in early 1934 became the target of an investigation by the young regime when it was alleged in the press that he had made disparaging and unpatriotic remarks about Austria in the aftermath of the February uprising. The final straw came when his house in Salzburg was searched for illegal weapons later that spring, leading Zweig to emigrate permanently from Austria, never to return. Stefan Zweig's final work, his autobiographical Die Welt von Gestern, is one of the most renowned works of cultural memory in the context of Central Europe on the eve of the Holocaust, considered to epitomize the nostalgia of German-speaking Jewish intellectuals and the bitter sense of loss and betrayal visited upon them with the eclipse of this world under National Socialism, as viscerally manifested in Zweig's suicide upon completion of this work. An earlier and related text, however, which has received far less attention to date, can be read in a slightly different light, namely a lecture that Zweig held in Paris in 1940 entitled Das Wien von Gestern. which proffers a decisively unnostalgic, surprisingly militant cultural vision of Vienna's, and by extension Austria's, place in European culture. Zweig opened the lecture by calling Vienna, quote, one of the capital cities of our common European culture, end quote, opining that there was no such thing as an Austrian people in a historical or ethnic sense, and thus positing Vienna and Austria as the product of European admixture. He then went on to speak in rather more militant terms about Vienna's, quote, historical mission, since Roman times to act as a, quote, bulwark of superior culture, not only to, quote, produce culture, but also, quote, to defend culture. Thus, Vienna had throughout its history served as a, quote, outpost of Latin civilization, as a bulwark of the Roman Catholic Church, and as the headquarters of the Counter-Reformation. The Ottoman invasion, he continued, twice broke upon the walls of Vienna, and in our times too, when barbarism erupted stronger and with a greater will to rule than ever before, Vienna and the Little Austria desperately clung to its European conviction, end quote. Austria's historical mission, Vienna as a bulwark of a superior Catholic culture, the intersections with Austrofascist discourse, I think, are too evident to ignore. Zweig continued that Vienna had always been the locus of the, quote, dream of a united Europe, a supranational empire, a Holy Roman Empire, not the world domination of Germandom, end quote. To be sure, Zweig explicitly pointed to Vienna's ancient admixture of languages and cultures, calling the Habsburg Empire, perhaps a little too benevolently, cosmopolitan, but to repeat, the essential cornerstones of the Austro-fascist vision of Austria's historic mission in Europe, I think, are too obvious to ignore. Coming now to the conclusion, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jewish patriotic, nationalistic, and even fascism engagements with Austria have been widely ignored, underestimated, or even dismissed in scholarship. For example, as an expression of a misguided and ultimately failed attempt to assimilate into their host society, a problematic because ethnically essentializing explanatory model. The Jewish engagements with the becoming of Austria in this area that I highlighted in this paper, as well as crucially their complex intersections with hegemonic nationalist and/or fascism discourses, in fact reveal a lot more about the fluid and processual nature of nation and state building in Europe at the time, and the role of Jewish intellectual elites therein, of multiple competing, variably inclusive or exclusive models of nationhood beyond mere ethnicity, and of the continuity and legacy of the pluriculturalism of the former empire in this short-lived yet productive period when Austria was coming to terms with its newfound independence. In words that seem to echo the ideas of Jewish writers like Roth and Zweig, Austria's first post-war chancellor, Leopold Fiegel, commented in 1946 that Austrians were, quote, a people that represents something unique in Europe, not a second German people, no, but an Austrian people, end quote. These words need to be viewed critically in light of Austria's reprehensible treatment of those groups, above all Jews, who were still not seen to belong, or even continue to be persecuted in the aftermath of Nazi rule, as well as the continuing problem of right-wing nativist and racist politics in Austria today. As the discourses I highlighted in this paper reveal, however, these problems are anything but new, and greater historical attention to the long-term development of more inclusive discourses on statehood and peoplehood in Austria would, I believe, prove very interesting for contemporary discussions on states, nations, and the future of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful paper. I jump to the next presentation immediately. And this is, yes, Elisabeth Hyde. Sie ist Postdoc im ERC Project Nepostrans, negotiating post-imperial. Can you hear me? Okay. Negotiating post-imperial transitions from remobilization to nation-state consolidation. Am Institute of Political History Budapest, wo sie beschäftigt sich mit der Übergangsphase nach dem Ersten Weltkrieg in Ostgalizien. Ihre Promotion im Blickfeld zweier Imperien, Galizien in der österreichischen und russischen Presseberichterstattung während des Ersten Weltkrieges, 1914, 1917 ist im 2019 erschienen. Elisabeth, Titel ist Kampf um die Sprache, Konflikte um Minderheitenschulen in Ostgalizien in der Zweiten Polnischen Republik. Elisabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gábor, for the introduction, and I just decided to speak in English as well, and I will try to share my screen. Okay, can
Yes,
works. So I will start with a quote. We are fighting for the full right that the Ukrainian people in all the territories can establish mother tongue schools of all grades and types for their children. That both the teaching and the supervision of these schools and the school administration are in Ukrainian hands. That these schools are sustained from the taxes paid by our people. End quote. So these were the demands of a Ukrainian pamphlet from Lviv in view of a new school law in the Polish Republic in 1924. Debates about mother tongue teaching were not new in Eastern Galicia. The school, and in particular the question of the language of instruction, already played an important role in nationality conflicts in Habsburg times. So to what extent then was this language fight a continuation of pre-war conflicts? And to what extent did these conflicts take on a new dimension through the establishment of new nation states after the war? So I will begin by outlining the Galician school system in Habsburg times, and then refer to the effects of the First World War and the establishment of nation states. Using the example of the contested region of Eastern Galicia, I would like to give an overview of how the legal foundations for the school system and the question of the language of instruction have changed within the framework of the Polish Republic. On the other hand, I would like to show that the implementation of the legal provisions depended to a certain extent on the local authorities. Due to time constraints, I will not be able to go into the comparison with other states, but this could possibly be a topic for the discussion. So you can see my next slide. It works. In the Habsburg monarchy, language rights were enshrined in the basic laws of 1867, which guaranteed the equality of all customary languages. So in the Austrian half of the empire, theoretically, all children had the right to mother tongue instruction. In practice, however, there was a clear imbalance in the education system in some regions. And in Galicia, this imbalance was particularly pronounced. A major factor was the population structure in Galicia. So in Eastern Galicia, the majority of the population was Ukrainian, or as it was called at the time, Ruthenian speaking. But most of these Ukrainian or Ruthenian speakers were peasants. So the elites and a large part of the urban population, including many Jews, were Polish speakers. And the concessions of the Viennese government in the 1860s, known as Galician autonomy, strengthened the position of the Polish elites and the political and cultural dominance in the province. So the Polish elites dominated the Galician diet, and Polish became the official language in Galicia. The Galician school board was also in Polish hands and promoted the dissemination of the Polish language of instruction in schools. Ukrainian deputies as well as several municipalities, complained that Ukrainian language schools were converted into bilingual, so-called Utrecht or Polish language schools against the will of the community. Moreover, almost all Ukrainian language schools were just 1 to 3 grade village schools, which in contrast to town schools or so-called citizens schools could not adequately prepare the students for attending a secondary school. Unlike in other crown lands, however, the Galician Diet and Galician School Board were responsible not only for the primary schools, but also for the secondary schools. So the foundation of every single Ukrainian secondary school had to be confirmed by the Galician Diet, which was dominated by Polish deputies. So the imbalance between Ukrainian language and Polish language schools was particularly pronounced in the field of secondary schools and high schools. On the eve of the First World War, out of 135 gymnasia in Galicia, only 12 were Ukrainian-speaking schools, including 7 private ones. So a major concern of the Ukrainian national movement in Galicia was, in addition to a stronger political voice in the Diet, the struggle for Ukrainian language education, and last but not least, for a Ukrainian university. Petitions by Ukrainian deputies to the Viennese government or the Austrian parliament, however, hardly changed Galician school policy. It was not until the so-called Polish-Ukrainian Compromise of 1914, which was negotiated under pressure from the Viennese government, that Polish representatives agreed to a Ukrainian university and to some new Ukrainian secondary schools. Due to the outbreak of the First World War, however, these concessions have not been implemented. During the war, Polish-Ukrainian conflict in Galicia intensified significantly, as Jagoda has already described in the morning. So when the Habsburg monarchy collapsed in 1918, both sides claimed Eastern Galicia for the nation state, the Polish Republic or the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. So the conflict escalated into a war between the two nesting states. The Western Ukrainian state-building project failed, as none of the claimed territories could be asserted militarily. While Bukovina had already been occupied by Romanian troops in autumn of 1918, the Ukrainian army in Eastern Galicia finally surrendered in the summer of 1919. So Eastern Galicia fell to the Polish Republic, but the annexation of the region remained controversial. Relying on the right of peoples to self-determination, Ukrainian politicians tried to continue the struggle at the diplomatic level. In the end, however, the Polish Republic was able to assert its claims, and in 1923, Eastern Galicia's affiliation with Poland was internationally recognized. The Second Polish Republic, which consisted of former Austrian, German, and Russian territories, presented itself as a Polish nation state. However, the population of the new state was by no means homogeneous. In the eastern provinces of the Polish state, the non-Polish speaking population, now called national minorities, was in many places the majority. This was also the case in Eastern Galicia. The understanding as a nation state justified a privileged position of the Polish language as a state language, as the state language. However, under pressure from the Allies, the Polish representatives had to sign a minority treaty together with the Peace Treaty of Versailles in 1919, as Sophia has already mentioned yesterday, which was intended to protect the national linguistic and religious minorities in Poland. The latter was particularly relevant for the Jewish population. On the one hand, the treaty guaranteed equal citizenship for minorities, and on the other hand, it gave them rights such as the right to mother tongue education. Article 8 of the Minority Treaty gave minorities the right to establish, manage, and control at their own expenses charitable, religious, and social institutions, schools, and other educational establishments, with the right to use their own language. Article 9 also obliged the Polish state to provide mother tongue instruction in public schools in cities and districts with a quote considerable proportion of non-Polish speaking residents. In addition, the Polish government promised a statute of autonomy for the contested territory of Eastern Galicia, which provided, among other things, for the establishment of a Ukrainian university. While the Minority Treaty was at least partially incorporated into the Polish constitution, the statute of autonomy for Eastern Galicia, however, was never implemented. Minority rights, as Sophia also discussed yesterday, remained a controversial issue in Poland. Many Poles regarded the Minority Treaty as being imposed from outside and as contradicting the nation state's efforts towards nationalization and unification. Even before the war, nationalist activists had demanded a Polonization of the Galician school system and had considered the measures of the Galician school board to be insufficient. So in view of the establishment of a Polish nation state, Polish nationalists saw their stance strengthened. Right-wing parties became the strongest force in the Polish parliament. So how were the rights guaranteed in the Minority Treaty implemented under these circumstances? First of all, it should be noted that legal regulations from the pre-war period remained provisionally in force until the respective law was replaced by a new one. As a result, different legislations applied in the different regions of Poland for years. So in Galicia, the Austrian school system was thus largely preserved. The first legal changes concerned the curriculum, in particular Polish language teaching, as well as Polish literature and history were introduced as compulsory subject in all schools. However, Ukrainian language schools were preserved. On the other hand, the Polish state built many additional schools in this period, and the majority of these new schools were Polish language schools. In 1924, a new law with special regulations for the eastern provinces of Poland brought further changes to primary schools. Indeed, according to the new law, the Polish state undertook to establish Ruthenian, Belarusian, or Lithuanian language public primary schools. However, the law did not take into account other minority languages, such as Yiddish or German. And moreover, the precondition of minority schools was this, that at least 25% of the population in the respective municipality belonged to the respective minority, and the parents of at least 40 Ruthenian, Belarusian, or Lithuanian children of school age applied for mother tongue teaching. However, if the parents of at least 20 children applied for Polish language teaching, and the parents of at least 40 for Ruthenian, Belarusian, or Lithuanian language teaching, the school should be converted into bilingual, so-called Utrechtist schools. And if the number of the declarations for a minority language was insufficient, schools should be converted into Polish language schools. Thus, the law at the same time reaffirmed the primacy of the Polish language as the state language. The law caused a lot of uproar, especially in Eastern Galicia, where the Ukrainian national movement had the greatest popularity compared to the former Russian regions. Also, the law provided for Ukrainian, or as it was officially called, Ruthenian language schools. It was obviously aimed at replacing them largely with Utrechtist or Polish schools. The law officially gave the decision on the language in the hands of the parents, but the specific provisions privileged the Polish language. In addition to the imbalance in the required number of parents' declarations, 40 or 20, other details made it difficult to establish minority schools. For example, declarations for native language teaching had to be confirmed by a notary or by the head of the municipality. In the case of declarations for the Polish language, such formalities were not necessary. In addition, the letter had a later submission deadline. And in many larger cities, the establishment of minority schools failed due to the required 25% share of the population for Ukrainians in Eastern Galicia, even if there were enough children for a minority school. While the Polish authorities argued that Utrechtist schools would promote peaceful coexistence and mutual understanding between the nationalities, Ukrainian activists feared that in practice the Utrechtist schools would be Polish language schools with a minimal proportion of Ukrainian teaching, and thus a means of Polonization. Ultimately, the law even exacerbated national polarization in Eastern Galicia, because both Ukrainian and Polish activists, the latter often with support of the Polish authorities, tried to persuade the local population to make declarations on the language of instruction. So these so-called school plebiscites often brought national conflicts into the village communities. The extent of these conflicts and the results of the school plebiscites depended on the activity of nationalist activists, but also on the actions of the Polish district authorities, who together with the school authorities assessed the validity of the declarations. And there were many reasons to invalidate declarations. So some district authorities, for example, did not recognize declarations that applied for Ukrainian instead of the official Ruthenian language of instruction. Moreover, they often argued that the declarations were signed under pressure from Ukrainian activists and did not correspond to the will of the parents. So the parents in question were often summoned for oral interrogation, which, as Ukrainian activists argued on the other hand, exposed the parents to the pressure from the Polish authorities. The statistics of the district authorities on this school plebiscite give an insight into the different practices. So in the district of Stadtschuf, for example, where before 1924, more than 2/3 of the schools had been Ukrainian language schools, the reduction of Ukrainian language schools was particularly radical. The results of the plebiscite in this district were largely based on Ukrainian votes being declared invalid. And the district police commander explained this invalidation by the fact that the Ukrainian agitators had not informed the population how the declarations had to be filled in properly. So he didn't question that the parents wanted Ukrainian schools, but that just they didn't fill the declarations properly. According to the results, 40% of schools in the district should be Polish language schools and around 60% bilingual. So non-Ukrainian schools at all. Also, these results were subsequently slightly amended. The number of Ukrainian language schools in the district remained marginal. The reports from Kolomia district, on the other hand, testify to a rather pragmatic approach by the authorities. According to the statistics of this district, 80% of the parents in the district voted for bilingual school, and only in some places for Ruthenian school, and in only very few occasions for Polish school. So other district authorities also reported that many parents would agree with Polish language instruction as long as Ukrainian language instruction was guaranteed as well. So bilingual schools could be a solution for many parents. Nevertheless, the statistics are striking in that the law only provided for declarations for the Ruthenian or Polish language and not for bilingual schools. So the district authorities obviously took a rather pragmatic approach. And they deviated from the law also in another point, because in the city of Kolomia, the proportion of the Ukrainian population was less than 25% according to the census. Thus, all schools would have had to be converted into Polish language ones. Nevertheless, the district authorities were in favor of preserving the two Ukrainian language schools, arguing that Ukrainian activists would otherwise set up private schools over which the Polish authorities would have less influence. Thus, while some local Polish authorities used all possible means to encourage the spread of Polish language schools and promote Polonization in the eastern provinces, others apparently tried to avoid open conflicts. Overall, the school plebiscites increased national mobilization in Eastern Galicia. Even before the war, educational issues, such as the struggle for Ukrainian university, sometimes received enormous public attention. However, while the scene of these conflicts had been mainly the urban centers, the struggle for primary schools in 1924 brought the conflicts to the village communities. So in this respect, conflicts significantly intensified after the war. However, the great response to this struggle for Ukrainian schools in Eastern Galicia, for example, in comparison to the former Russian territories of Poland, can hardly be explained without considering the developments in the pre-war period. So it was based not least on the high level of organization of the Ukrainian national movement in Eastern Galicia, which had been active in the rural areas for decades, for example, through reading clubs in the villages. Galician Ukrainian activists had experience in political struggles and were willing to fight for their rights by any means the law offered. For example, the Ukrainian pamphlet quoted at the beginning argued that the Ukrainian people must use the school law for their own interests and reach as many establish many Ukrainian language schools as possible by issuing declarations. However, nationalist activities did not always remain within the scope of the law. Overall, in the course of the interwar period, there has been a remarked radicalization of national conflicts. Nationalists were increasingly willing to resort to means such as terror. On the other hand, Ukrainian organizations, but also other minorities, such as Jews, increasingly relied on private schools in order to achieve greater independence from the Polish authorities. Overall, the struggle for minority schools in Eastern Galicia reveals some continuities to Polish-Ukrainian conflicts of the pre-war period. Polish nationalists demanded a strengthening of the Polish language in the education system, while Ukrainian ones complained of discrimination by the Polish-dominated school authorities. While the Austrian constitution stipulated equality of all customary languages, in the Polish Republic, Poles could rely on a primacy of the Polish language as the state language. Nevertheless, the Minority Treaty guaranteed the rights to minority schools. Hence, the main problem continued to be not so much the legal basis, but its implementation. Local authorities played an essential role in this. Their actions could intensify or calm national conflict. In Habsburg times, also the Viennese government was still regarded to a certain extent as a mediation authority. The Warsaw government in interwar Poland could hardly fulfill this role. So in this period, the hopes of minority representatives rested rather on the League of Nations. However, even the Habsburg monarchy, interventions from Vienna did not always have practical effects on Galician school policy, and this was all the more true for the League of Nations. The incorporation of Eastern Galicia into the Polish Republic thus resulted in national radicalization, both on the part of Polish politics and on the part of minorities. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Thomas Ort, who is an associate professor of modern European history at Queen's College, the City University of New York. He's the author of Art and Life in Modernist Prague, Karel Čapek and His Generation, 1911-1938, published in 2013, which has also been published in Czech translation 3 years later. He's now working on a book concerning the memory of the 1942 assassination in Prague of Reinhard Egry, which is a very fascinating topic. Nevertheless, today he will speak of an ordinary marriage, Czech-German matrimony, and Karel Čapek's An Ordinary Life. So, Thomas Ort, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Gábor, and I also want to thank the organizers for their heroic efforts to make this conference happen. And my only regret, of course, is that we're not actually together in Vienna. That would have been very nice. So let me get started by sharing my screen. I have a very spare PowerPoint, but nonetheless something that you can look at while I talk. Can everybody see that? Okay, great. So the Czech writer, Karl Čapek, he's best known, as you probably know, for his 1920 play RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots. This is the play in which he coined the word robot, as well as for his 1936 novel, The War with the Newts, which, if you don't know it, is just a brilliant satire of Europe in an era of dictatorship. His critical masterpiece, however, is usually considered to be the trilogy of novels he wrote in 1933 and 1934, Hordebal, Meteor, and An Ordinary Life. Those are the titles in English. These books are usually referred to as Čapek's philosophical novels, and they have been rightly praised for their skillful handling of complex epistemological issues. What's less often noted is that at the center of the third and arguably greatest of these novels, An Ordinary Life, there lies a unique portrayal of Czech-German marital relations. Because the protagonist of Čapek's novel, his ordinary man, is married to a German woman. So why did Čapek put a Czech-German marriage at the center of this novel? And what does this marriage say about his conception of Czech-German relations in the 1930s? To get right to the point, I believe that in the context of the Nazi rise to power and of the deterioration of Czech-German relations within Czechoslovakia in the mid-1930s, Čapek's decision to place this marriage prominently in the culminating novel of his trilogy was a plea to prevent a Czech-German divorce, and thereby to hold together the fragile, nationally divided state of Czechoslovakia. I need to say straight away, too, that the marriage at the heart of An Ordinary Life represents a highly idealized vision of Czech-German relations. Čapek's ordinary man repeatedly claims that the union with his wife was a happy one and that their love was deep and true. This marriage, like any other, has its ups and downs, but they don't get divorced, and they never even seriously contemplate divorce. Having said that, as amicable as this marriage appears to be, it is not a relationship of equality, because the German wife willingly subordinates herself to her Czech husband. Čapek was, as you may know, a fierce critic of Czech national chauvinism, but he also clearly believed in Czech predominance in Czechoslovakia. And that meant that the country's German population needed to acknowledge that Czechs had the leading role in the state. And An Ordinary Marriage clearly underscores that perspective. At the same time, it calls into question certain nationalist orthodoxies. Čapek's matter-of-fact representation of Czech-German intermarriage challenges nationalist ideas about the mutual antagonism of Czechs and Germans in Bohemia. Even more interestingly, it suggests some flexibility, if not indeterminacy, in the national sentiments of his protagonist, and I'll return to that point in a moment. The fact of Czech-German marriage passes almost without comment in the novel, and the relationship between the Czech man and the German woman is conventional to the point of tedium. But this seems to be precisely Čapek's point. The precondition of the Czechoslovak state's preservation was, in his mind, the transcendence by its citizens of the national, class, and other barriers that divided them. And this could only take place at the level of the individual. And it involved the refusal to limit the conception of the self to any one identity, character, or quality. So in this way, the marriage at the heart of An Ordinary Life mirrors the central theme of the novel and embodies its political purpose. At the same time, it points to some of the limits of Čapek's imagination. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Sadly, of course, I don't have time to go into the details of An Ordinary Life. I'm not going to give any summary of it. Suffice it to say that the novel concerns an ordinary man. He's never named, so I have to always refer to him as the ordinary man. And this man decides to write down the story of his life as his death is approaching. He's a retired official of the Austro-Hungarian and subsequently the Czechoslovak railway systems. The reader is given his birth year, 1864, and is also told that he's 70 years old at the time of the writing of his autobiography. That means that the decisive action of the novel takes place in 1934, the year in which it was written. There's no question that it was clearly intended as a commentary on life in the First Republic. Let me also say a few words about Czech-German intermarriage in Bohemia. Intermarriage between Czech speakers and German speakers was once so common as to be wholly unremarkable. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it became a suspect practice in the eyes of both Czech and German nationalist activists who viewed it as evidence of weak national consciousness or a sign of possible disloyalty to the nation. The marriage that Čapek depicts in Ordinary Life is therefore, at its most basic level, a repudiation of the demand for Czech-German apartheid that nationalist activists desired. But it's much more than that too. I believe it's also a defense, albeit a qualified one, of precisely that which nationalist activists most despised, that is, national ambiguity or indifference. Let me explain. One curious feature of Čapek's novel is that its protagonist spends a significant portion of his life in either a German milieu or a nationally ambiguous one. The ordinary man is raised in a Czech-speaking household and is identified as Czech, but as a young man, he's transferred from his first job at Franz Josef station in Prague to a tiny station in a German-populated region of Bohemia. The location is never specified, but the physical description suggests someplace like northern Bohemia, and the Germans who live there seem to be engaged mainly in the lumber and forestry industry. After a stay there of unspecified duration, the ordinary man is transferred to a larger station run by a German station master. And Čapek's portrait of this station master really could not be more sympathetic. The station master is fastidious, but kindly, strict, but good-natured. His station is beautifully maintained, and relations among his employees are happy and harmonious. The ordinary man even imagines the emperor himself alighting there and congratulating the station master on his exemplary management. This reference to the emperor is, of course, not incidental, because the station is really meant to embody all that was good about the Habsburg Empire and represents a fairly idealized vision of it. But it's at this station, too, that the ordinary man meets and falls in love with the woman who will become his wife. That's the station master's daughter. So he marries, in other words, into a German family. The station master takes the ordinary man under his wing and becomes a kind of surrogate father to him. The ordinary man's real father, his Czech father, hardly appears in the novel at all after the marriage. His German father-in-law, in contrast, plays a prominent role, using his influence to help the ordinary man advance his career. With his assistance, the couple moves to a larger industrial station where the ordinary man acquires new responsibilities and authority. Whether this milieu is predominantly Czech or German is unclear. It's simply not indicated, and it really could be either. After several years at this industrial junction, the ordinary man and his wife are transferred again, once more, to a nationally ambiguous locale. The new station lies in the vicinity of several large country estates and serves an overwhelmingly aristocratic clientele. A prince, a couple of counts, and an assortment of titled peers are among its main patrons. Although in interwar Czechoslovakia, the Bohemian nobility was generally perceived as German, in Habsburg times, this social group, for the most part, shunned nationalism and sought to maintain a cosmopolitan, supranational attitude. Now, while this posture was increasingly difficult to sustain, especially after 1918, the nobility was one of the last institutions in Bohemia to be nationalized, at least according to the historian Egil Glassheim in his book Noble Nationalists. Čapek's choice of setting thus seems deliberately designed to emphasize national ambiguity. In any case, it's at this station that the ordinary man achieves one of his greatest ambitions. He becomes station master. He takes great pride and pleasure in his management of the station, which he runs with precision and efficiency. The man experiences the satisfaction of creating something all his own, according to his inner values and desires. Significantly, there is nothing specifically Czech, or for that matter, German, about it. What matters to him is order and efficiency, not national feeling. In the year 1918 or 1919, when the ordinary man is 54 or 55 years old, he's transferred back to Prague as a high-level administrator in what is now the Czechoslovak railway system. And this, of course, is a decidedly Czech milieu. But for approximately 30 years between the time the man moves to the small station in northern Bohemia and is returned to Prague, the ordinary man lives in what seems to be either a German setting or a nationally ambiguous one, all the while happily married into a German family. Another remarkable feature of the novel is that the language of communication between the ordinary man and his wife is never mentioned. Čapek gives no hint as to whether they speak German together, or Czech, or some combination of the two. Since the ordinary man is symbolically adopted into the wife's family, and since he lives for so long among Germans, it seems clear that he's bilingual, and it's not unreasonable to assume that he speaks German with his wife. There is, however, no textual evidence to support this assumption. By the same token, there's no evidence to suggest that the ordinary man and his wife speak Czech together. Čapek left the question of their language of communication wholly ambiguous. In the character of the ordinary man, then, Čapek appears to have crafted a portrait of a nationally indifferent person, the bête noire of nationalist activists, known by many different labels, including hermaphrodites, amphibians, and renegades. Nationally indifferent individuals were the frustrating people who, in the words of our keynote speaker, Tarzar, refused, quote, to organize their lives or political allegiances according to nationalist priorities. Nationalists targeted them rhetorically and politically, seeking either through persuasion or coercion to move them off the fence and declare themselves for one side or the other. In Zara's reckoning, national indifference sometimes denoted the complete absence of national loyalties and self-conscious spurning of labels such as Czech or German, but more often than not, it referred to a more general ambivalence with respect to national affiliation, characterized by fluidity and a rejection of the all-encompassing demands of nationalist activists. It's in this latter sense that the ordinary man is properly labeled indifferent, for he never altogether lacks national consciousness. As mentioned before, He is born into a Czech-speaking household and generally thinks of himself as Czech. But Czechness is simply not a major component of the man's identity, and it only affects his life and marriage in minimal ways up to a point. And the point at which things change is the First World War. When the war breaks out in 1914, it shatters not only the serenity of the ordinary man's aristocratic station, but it also drives a wedge of national feeling between him and his wife. He loathes the war from the start, less out of political or moral conviction than for the resentment at the chaos it brings to his peaceful, well-ordered station. She, in contrast, reflexively supports the war and displays unshakable faith in the emperor. Acting on his disgust for the war, the ordinary man joins the Czech home resistance, passing on information about the movement of troops and supplies, not to mention actively sabotaging the railway network he adores. The whole experience is contrary to his sense of order, stability, and caution. He knows he's engaged in high treason, punishable by death, but he's undeterred. In the process, he discovers in himself strong feelings of national belonging. What had been a largely passive form of identification now becomes active and enthusiastic. As a result of the experience of the war, the ordinary man can no longer be said to be nationally indifferent. Now he truly feels and acts Czech. What is fascinating about this transformation is that Čapek makes clear that it is the pressure of historical circumstances, the war, that affects the change. He seems to be suggesting that under other historical circumstances, the ordinary man may have never learned to make Czechness a central component of his identity. Indeed, under other circumstances, he might have become German or at least maintained his indifference. National loyalty, in other words, is not innate or absolute, but rather is situational and historical. And it's events like the war that crystallize and consolidate national sentiment. If the war is the greatest moment of rift between the ordinary man and his wife, then it's also true that the ordinary man has no more significant social relationship in his adult life than the one with his wife. No human bond matters to him more. She is by far his closest friend and confidant. Czech-German relations, therefore, have a highly privileged place in the novel. And the marriage between the ordinary man and his wife is characterized overall by warmth, happiness, and harmony, at least according to Čapek. However, there are some strains. From the earliest days of the union, and this is where things get interesting, the man is unsatisfied sexually. His erotic imagination is more capacious than that of his young and inexperienced bride, and he's far more keen to act on it than she. He wishes from her more overt expression of desire. He wants to be wanted. And not just that, he wants her to enjoy their intercourse too, not just to do her marital duty, but to take pleasure in their couplings. Their desire for one another is not fully reciprocal, in other words. In Čapek's representation, this Czech-German union is happy and harmonious for the most part, but lacking from the vantage of desire. In an interior dialogue between different components of the man's self, one part of the man says to another, "Yes, yes, you loved her, but you also hated her. Just remember how many times you lay beside her while she slept and you thought, God, to throttle her like this, to grab that neck with both hands and squeeze, squeeze." The voice continues. Only once did you revenge yourself a bit on her, when you worked against the emperor. I'll give you something, you German. The man's wartime resistance is recast here as a nationalist revenge fantasy perpetrated on his wife. Now, just to be clear, these are flights of fancy that are never acted upon and are repudiated by the ordinary man's everyday sense of himself. Nonetheless, they are clearly significant because Čapek seems to be suggesting that dark impulses lurk beneath the surface of even the most congenial Czech-German relations. The core problem of the marriage, however, is more prosaic. As I said before, it is wildly unequal. The ordinary man's wife is meek and submissive in her relations with him. She washes his back, scrubs his back, washes his feet, cooks his food, tends his house, all without the slightest complaint. She is his subordinate and helper in every way, facilitating the achievement of his aims while articulating no aspirations of her own. Her goals are simply his goals. The German wife knows her place in this relationship. The Czech husband's needs and desires come first. He has the leading role. Čapek's depiction of this marriage is also gendered in a way that reinforces Czech dominance and German subordination. In most of the novel, the Czech is the man in the relationship, and his German wife is more like a prepubescent girl. In his marriage, the ordinary man exudes a potent, almost animal-like virility. Though he was shy and sickly in his youth, he develops into, quote, a broad-shouldered worker, weary and hairy with a chest like a cupboard. After a hard day on the job, the ordinary man's wife greets her manly man with a towel in hand, washes him clean and dries his back, quote, like a big and good animal. Elsewhere, Čapek refers to the ordinary man as strong and dusky, as rapacious in his appetites and schooled in the ways of the flesh. She, on the other hand, is not just feminized, but rendered positively childlike. She's described as delicate, angelically pure, maiden-like, naive, and inexperienced. I should say that this gender discourse draws on a trope in Czech modernist culture, whereby Czechs are gendered masculine and characterized as outward-looking, confident, and potent, whereas Germans are feminized and cast as inward-looking, anxious, and impotent. I wrote an article about this a few years ago. But in light of Tarazara's talk yesterday, I now also see that there's actually a racial dimension of this discourse too. Remember, the Czech man is described as dusky. That is, he's a bit dark. He's also hairy and sweaty and kind of dirty. He's animal-like. Now, these are common gender stereotypes of Slavic men, and they're usually cast as negative. But Čapek actually inverts them here, giving them a positive valence of masculine potency. This breakdown of gender roles, however, that I just described is complicated by other references to the ordinary man's wife as a maternal figure concerned about the relapse of her husband's ill health. In this perspective, it's the Czech man who is like a child and the German wife mother who is the more powerful adult. So if for most of their marriage, the ordinary man is firmly in charge, the man of the house, there are moments of weakness when he is her dependent too. I have a theory about that, but I don't have time to go into it. Still, overall, there can be no question that Čapek's conception of harmonious Czech-German relations is predicated on the fundamental inequality of man and wife, on the submission and subordination of the German wife to her Czech husband. Nowhere in the novel does Čapek seem to acknowledge that willing subordinate may not be the most satisfying role for the ordinary man's life, and by extension, for Czechoslovakia's German population. This is not to say that there was any obvious or easy answer to the German question in Czechoslovakia, but Čapek's representation of what constitutes a successful Czech-German union seems to fall rather short. Nonetheless, the fact of the intermarriage and the initially ambiguous national identity of the ordinary man was certainly intended as a rebuke to nationalists and a model for the refusal to limit the conception of the self to any one identity, character, or quality. At the same time, in Čapek's telling, the First World War had the effect of crystallizing and hardening national identities. After the war, there are no more suggestions of national indifference on the part of the ordinary man or his wife. There are now Czechs and Germans and not much else in between. And yet, an honest interrogation of the self reveals that these categories, however strongly felt they may be in 1934, are historical and situational. They're not absolute. Finally, as much as an ordinary life is an argument for the preservation of the union and against divorce, there is one way in which Čapek does appear to acknowledge an impending problem of Czech-German relations that goes beyond the inequity of desire. That is, the ordinary man and his wife consummate their marriage, but it bears no fruit. They are childless, and that certainly suggests an uncertain future for Czech-German relations and for Czechoslovakia as a state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we can quickly go to the Q&A session. So if you have any comments, questions, just raise your hand and we will make you able to speak. Try to monitor. Okay, so I can't see anyone. So probably I have a few questions for Andrei Sorescu.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's really fascinating. I like very much this paper and your work. You asked possible comparisons, so I will start with.
Oh, thank you. That would be lovely.
So the most obvious, I think, which is not just a comparison, but actually I think it's an entanglement, and you can find it in the Hungarian discourse, and especially in the interwar Hungarian discourse on Hungarian minorities. But it also brings in this issue of temporal horizon, because in that case, national unity of the minorities is also positive. So it could be an interesting question, how far it is a real unity or some kind of interesting stereotype regarding these minorities seen from the center. But also, if you look at how the national unity that should be recreated in terms of irredentism is imagined, especially not just from the minority perspective, but also from some of the Hungarian central perspective, it's always posited in the future, even after political reannexation of some of these territories, because of this imagined national unity of the minorities. So it's always thought of as being in the future, because the real unity will be when the Hungarian society from Hungary proper will be transformed along the lines of the minorities. And maybe I'm interested in whether you can think of, or whether you think your case somehow it could be aligned with that kind of temporality. And I'm also interested in how far do you think that the afterlife of this discourse, which you qualified as disappearing, is still present in interwar Romania in this strange permanent debate about who liberated who?
Oh, thank you for that. On the first account, thank you for the suggestion. And yes, entanglements are everywhere. I didn't quite have the time to get into it in the end. But for instance, even in the 19th century, there was a minor squabble between Hungarians and Romanians over the fact that, well, Romania annexed the Dobruja in 1878. The Dobruja on the Black Sea seaboard was a multi-ethnic region, with Bulgarians in particular there being fairly dissatisfied and nationalized along, well, the national lines as dictated from Bulgaria in some cases, although one must not overemphasize Bulgarian irredentism there, as the Romanian nationalists would. But Hungarians, for instance, in the Kingdom of Hungary, tried to dismiss Romanian overtures towards supporting Romanians in the Kingdom of Hungary, if only because Hungarians could then point to Bulgarians in the Dobruja and say, look, you're doing unto them as you claim we do unto yours. To which, and I've seen this on repeated accounts, Romanian politicians would say, well, apparently not in connection to that, although sometimes in connection to that explicitly, we should do our best to make our Bulgarians feel through prosperity alone, if not through direct national affiliation, that living under Romanian rule is indeed superior to even living in Bulgaria. And this is the sort of thing that they see again in 1913 after southern Dobruja is annexed to Romania further on. Temporal horizons, well, absolutely. I mean, again, as you say, when it comes to the 1930s, I'm not entirely sure. So I do sort of cut my research short at 1918. And in fact, in fairness, slightly earlier than that still, insofar as the War of Pamphlets that rages between 1914 and 16, where Romania gets into the war, is quite a capacious and an engrossing corpus all its own. But after 1918, I would say, I mean, along the lines of who liberated whom, yes, there might, I mean, I have noted examples of Transylvanians, you know, hearkening back to the sort of previous discursive era, saying, and by the way, you used to say this and that about us, you know, being the sort of ferment and catalyst for further civilizing yourselves for your own salvation, and yet here we are, you know, bereft of what had initially been promised to be a level of autonomy, so on and so forth, you know, being colonized by your bureaucratic apparatus, by your corrupt politicians, and so on and so forth. So yes, there is some reference being made, and there is this book. Oh, quite ashamed to say, I do forget the name of the author, but it must be someone who's familiar to you. Siebenbürger. Yes. Now that the topos.
Oh,
yeah. Yes. Thank you so much. I mean, the topos examined there is, I think, fairly incorrectly identified as being of somewhat more recent vintage, and it's invoked in the 1930s. But if you dig deeper, you'll see that even then, I mean, which is to say, even before 1914, there is some notion of the fact that that people in the Old Kingdom might want a Transylvania without Transylvanians. You know, they're more enamored with its infrastructure and its wealth than with the independent-minded Transylvanians. Of course, this is then portrayed as anti-national slander, right? But it does go a bit deeper than that. So there are obviously various balances to how the Old Kingdom saw Transylvania, or how it felt like when the mask slipped, if you will. But, you know, don't let me ramble. Thank you so much, and, you know, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, if you are, I would gladly speak of these issues with you, even outside the framework of the conference, if you think.
We'd love to.
That would be helpful. It would be very helpful for me as well.
Well, thank you.
So I still can't. Oh, there is someone. Okay, so I just have to find. Christian Karner, although okay, it's easier. Okay, Christian Karner, you are supposed to be able to speak right now. No?
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me now? I've just been
Yes.
muted and then I left the room and now I think I'm back. Thank you for really excellent and fascinating papers. My question is to Tim. Tim, I was really spellbound by your discussion and the kinds of entanglements and sort of ideological and discursive crossovers you're describing are, I think they just warrant far more discussion, as you say, than they've received. So I thought that was really, really fascinating. I was reminded in terms of your kind of dissection of some of the particular claims both Roth and Zweig made. I was reminded of some of the claims made more than a century prior to Roth and Zweig. So I'm thinking of Friedrich Schlegel, who actually sort of argued rather similarly as a convert to Catholicism himself, also kind of constructed Austria as the real sort of bastion of Germandom against, in that case, more the French rather than the East or elsewhere. But I wondered whether in your dissection of Roth and Zweig, do they reference Schlegel? Do they reference anyone else? Do they reference anyone at all? Or are there sort of assertions really just cross references to what Austrofascism was doing at the time? Are they just kind of bits of political polemic, or do they have that kind of history of ideas that I think you were nodding towards as well? But again, thank you for your talk and for all your talks. Really, really excellent. Thanks.
Thank you, Christian. That's a really, I think very astute comment. And it does remind me, I mentioned, for example, William Johnston, who is not, I don't think he's widely read outside of the more narrow scope of Austrian studies, which is a shame. And for example, in his work, Der österreichische Mensch, you just look in the list of contents and you see all these names, including very prominently Josef Roth, and it strikes you like, okay, I mean, there are a lot of Jewish people here. And he only talks about it much, much later, sort of towards the end. He comments on that and says, yes, there are many of these people who were involved in these discourses were Jewish. And then he himself says, I don't know what that means, and I don't want to sort of get into a discussion about that because I'm not sure what it means. And I think that, of course, is in a way a call to say, well, let's talk about this. I think it's just fascinating that so many of the people who were so eminently involved in these discussions, and you're absolutely right to say, and that's what Johnston does. Moritz Czaki has done a similar thing on a broader level with the Habsburg Empire. But, is looking back all the way, as you say, all the way back into the 19th century and saying these discourses are quite old, actually. There tends to be, and this is why sort of my little dig at German studies, for example, there tends to be this dismissive attitude as though Austrians sort of invented themselves in April 1945, which is rather, missing the point a little bit. To your specific question of whether they reference Schlegel, for example, I honestly have never heard of Friedrich Schlegel, so thanks, I'll have to look into him. And so, no, I haven't seen him referenced by these individuals. I think the discourses I spoke about were much more prominent with Roth than Zweig anyway, I should say that right away. But I can think of examples. I mean, something that strikes me with Roth, and it really does bother me that to use another field in Jewish studies, he's so often cast in terms of, this sort of German Jewish intellectual. So, for example, in Radetzky Marsch, there's a wonderful scene where Karl Trotter Senior is testing Karl Trotter Jr. on his knowledge of literature. And of course, it's German language literature, but then it's like, what are the authors that he's being tested on? And they are Stifter and Saar and others, they are all the titans of 19th century Austrian literature, not Goethe, not Schiller. I think these sorts of course, you're talking about many different text types here as well. So there's Roth, the fictional, the author, there's Roth, the polemic, Roth, the journalist, and so on. And then there's the correspondence, and you need to disentangle a lot of different things, but I think it's just such an eminently Austrian discourse, and I think it's incredible that that is very rarely commented upon. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Oh, there is one more hands raised. I just okay, so Thomas Ort, and with this intervention, we will conclude this very long morning class.
I actually also had a question for Tim. So since we're on the subject of his paper, I thought I might as well pose it. I thought your paper was really fascinating as well, Tim, and really thought-provoking. But I want to, push you a little bit on your main argument. First of all, what did these, Austrofascists, even the ones who weren't explicitly anti-Semitic, do in 1938 at the time of the Anschluss? I mean, did they defend their German, Jewish, compatriots or not? I think that's a pretty relevant question. I'm sure you understand that. But more generally, I mean, I do wonder, though, if you're not downplaying the anti-Semitic content of the Austrofascist movement. I mean, even if not everybody was anti-Semitic, and I think you have some strong evidence to suggest that, there were a lot of people who were. So I'll leave it at that.
Was that the end of the question? Thanks. Thank you. And yeah, I admit, of course, I'm sort of provoking with this paper, but I figured, why not? I think provocations are sometimes a good way to start a discussion. And yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that Austrofascism wasn't anti-Semitic, would be ridiculous. But I did I mentioned that book. I mean, it's huge. It's this huge volume on anti-Semitism written by a lot of left-wing academics where you think, well, like I say, there is another side to it. And I think that's interesting, even just levels like I mentioned with Schuschnigg, that he writes this sort of Mein Kampf of Austria, and he just doesn't mention the topic at all. Of course, he doesn't do it in a positive way either. He doesn't say, oh, by the way, we have a big Jewish population, and I think they're swell. He doesn't do that. But the absence of a discussion, I think, in itself is interesting. So I agree with you. And I mean, there's no need to debate what happens with Austrofascists in 1938. I think it's clear. I mean, the very senior ones tend to be persecuted, right? But there were many turncoats, also abundantly clear. I mean, Jews are obviously the kind of big losers in these discussions, because on the one hand, they are so integrally involved in formulating these discourses, and on the other hand, they're the big losers afterwards. And this is why I mentioned, if only very briefly, Leopold Fiegel. It's interesting that you get people picking up on these discourses after 1945 without at any point sort of going into the fact that these were also Jewish discourses in that sense. So I think all your points are completely valid, and I'm glad I was able to provoke that a little bit. And if I may respond with my own little question, I was also wondering, I loved your talk as well, and I wondered also very naively, where are Jews in this? Because it's this German Czech, and it's like, where are the Jews there too? So leave it there.
They're not in this novel, is the answer to that question.
Okay, so this is probably the end of the discussion. There is one bibliographic reference addressed to Tim Corbett in the chat, so please take a look at it. And thank you very much for papers. Thank you very much for the interventions, discussions, and we will see each other in the afternoon session. So have a nice lunch. Bye.